The chandeliers glowed like suspended galaxies, their crystals catching every flicker of candlelight and scattering it across polished glassware and folded linen. The room hummed with the muted rhythm of privilege, forks clinking against porcelain, low laughter softened by velvet drapes, the air heavy with the scent of truffle oil and aged wine. Every detail of Le Renault, the city's crown jewel of fine dining, seemed curated to remind those inside that they were important, that they belonged. When Ethan Cross pushed through the revolving doors, heads barely turned. He carried himself with that quiet command that made even his silences feel deliberate. A tailored gray suit hugged his broad frame, the cut so precise it whispered of designers who only made one-of-a-kind garments. His silver tie pin gleamed beneath the soft lights, but it was his eyes that truly held power, calm, dark, and unreadable. In boardrooms, those eyes had dismantled competitors, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, and secured him the title of one of the most ruthless CEOs in the world. Tonight, however, he sought nothing more than a quiet meal. At least, that's what it looked like. The hostess noticed him the moment he approached. She was tall, platinum blonde hair, slicked into a bun so tight it looked painful, her lips painted in a shade of red designed to intimidate more than invite. Her smile was practiced, but it faltered just slightly as she glanced him up and down. Something in his tone when he said table for one and the quiet simplicity of his request seemed to rub against the performance of wealth expected in this temple of exclusivity. She clutched her reservation book like a shield. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" she asked, her voice clipped, almost brittle. "I don't need one." The words were simple, calm, but delivered with the unshakable confidence of a man who knew he didn't wait in lines. Yet instead of the respect it should have commanded, the hostess's laugh was sharp and dismissive, meant to remind him that power here was hers to wield. "Sir, we're fully booked for weeks. Perhaps a more casual place would suit you. 2 blocks down." "I'll have a table here tonight," Ethan said. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it settled in the space between them. For a moment, the chandelier light seemed to pause. The hostess blinked, her facade cracking under the steady pressure of his gaze. Around them, a few diners had begun to watch, pearl necklaces glinting as they leaned in to whisper behind manicured hands. An elderly man in a 3-piece suit whispered something to his wife, both of them turning toward Ethan with thinly veiled disapproval. Finally, the hostess relented, her smile tightening like a noose. "Fine, follow me." She led him through the hall of power tables, those prized spots near windows overlooking the city skyline, where fortunes were sealed over vintage wine and whispered secrets. Ethan passed them all, unfazed, his polished shoes steady on the marble floor. But instead of one of the coveted tables, the hostess stopped at the far end, near the swinging kitchen doors. The smell of roasted garlic and the clatter of dishes spilled into the room each time they opened. The table was cramped, tucked against a wall, positioned as if the restaurant wanted to hide whoever sat there. "Your server will be with you shortly," she said quickly, turning before he even sat down. Ethan lowered himself into the chair without complaint. His posture didn't falter, his presence filling the small space as though he'd chosen it himself, but those who watched knew better. The insult was clear. Here, he was being told without words that he didn't belong. Across the room, Naomi Carter saw it all. She'd seen it too many times. The sea, calculated cruelty hidden in polite smiles, the way certain customers were shuffled to the corners, served slowly, treated like burdens instead of guests. Her tray trembled slightly in her hands as she adjusted a water glass on another table. 28 years old, working 2 jobs to keep her younger sister's college dream alive, Naomi had learned to survive by swallowing her pride. Yet something about this man's quiet composure, the way he sat unbothered at the worst table in the best restaurant, made her chest ache with both anger and recognition. Ethan Cross didn't flinch under the weight of judgmental stares. He simply folded his hands, leaned back, and let the moment hang. And in that silence, Naomi felt something stir inside her. The air was heavy with suspense, though no one else seemed to recognize it, not yet. But Naomi did. She knew deep in her bones that this night would not end the way the hostess or the sneering guests expected. Something had just begun, and she could feel the ground beneath her shifting. The hum of the dining room faded for Ethan as he sat at the small table pressed against the wall. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, a rush of heat and clatter broke the illusion of refinement, reminding him where he had been deliberately placed. He glanced briefly around, noting the strategic positioning of servers, the way no one seemed eager to approach his table. Still, his face remained calm, unreadable. He had been in colder rooms than this, but rarely had the contempt been so obvious. At last, Naomi Carter approached. She carried a leather-bound menu in one hand, a silver pitcher of water in the other. Her steps were steady, but inside, her stomach churned. She had seen Bradley, the server assigned to this section, deliberately avoid looking at Ethan's table, pretending to be too busy polishing glasses to do his job. Naomi couldn't watch it happen again, not to someone who was sitting with that kind of dignity in the middle of humiliation. She placed the menu gently on the table, filling his glass with practiced precision. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice warm yet professional. "My name is Naomi, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Ethan looked up at her. For the first time since stepping into the restaurant, he allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. "Thank you, Naomi." She nodded, tucking the pitcher against her side. "Would you like to start with something to drink? We have a fine selection of wines." "Just water for now," Ethan said, his deep voice carrying easily over the dining room's hushed tones. "And I'll have the ribeye, medium rare, with seasonal vegetables." Naomi's pen paused for only a second. He hadn't even opened the menu, hadn't asked for recommendations. He'd chosen the ribeye, the restaurant's pride, and one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. She jotted it down quickly, giving a small, polite smile. "Excellent choice. I'll have that right out for you." As she turned toward the kitchen, her breath caught. She knew exactly what was waiting behind those double doors. The kitchen was a different world: heat, steam, and the sharp scent of seared garlic and butter. At the center stood Richard Beaumont, the executive chef, a man with talent sharp enough to keep him employed and cruelty deep enough to keep his staff afraid. Naomi clipped the order ticket onto the rail, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Table 12 wants the ribeye," she said. Richard glanced toward the small kitchen window, catching sight of Ethan in his gray suit by the swinging doors. A smirk curved across his thin lips. "That guy in the corner? The one in the cheap suit?" "It's not cheap," Naomi muttered before she could stop herself. Richard's pale blue eyes snapped to hers, narrowing. "You got something to say, Carter?" His tone was sharp enough to cut through the clatter of pots. The kitchen fell silent. Naomi swallowed. "No, chef." "That's what I thought." Richard leaned toward Marcus, his sous chef, who already had a cruel smile tugging at his mouth. "We've got that ribeye from yesterday's service. Still good enough. He won't know the difference." Naomi froze. Her throat tightened, her pen digging into her palm as she clenched her order pad. "Yes, chef," Marcus said with a laugh, already heading toward the walk-in cooler. Naomi wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the plate into Richard's smug face. But she stood still, her chest burning, the weight of her family's needs pressing down on her like chains. Her younger sister's tuition, the rent, the endless stack of bills, it all depended on this job. And yet, as she watched Marcus pull a cold steak from the cooler, as she listened to the mocking laughter echo off the kitchen tiles, a thought seared its way into her mind. How much longer could she stay silent? Naomi turned back toward the dining room, her hands trembling, her heart pounding like a drum. Ethan sat alone, dignified and patient, the hum of privilege buzzing around him. He didn't know it yet, but the steak he had just ordered wasn't a meal. It was about to become the spark that lit a fire neither of them could control. The ribeye sizzled on the stove, the hiss of meat against steel drowning out Naomi's thoughts for a moment. Marcus flipped it carelessly, smirking as though this small act of deception was a private joke. Around him, the other cooks kept their heads down, knives clattering against cutting boards, ladles stirring simmering sauces, but none dared to speak. Silence was its own form of complicity in this kitchen, and Naomi knew it well. She lingered near the prep station, pretending to wipe down the counter, though every part of her was burning with the urge to shout. She thought of all the nights she'd stood right here and let the same cruelty slide, the hostess accidentally seating certain guests in bad sections, servers drawing straws to avoid tables of customers who didn't look the part, food plated with less care when management decided someone wasn't worth it. The system wasn't just broken, it was designed to be. Her chest tightened. She had survived here by biting her tongue, keeping her head down, smiling when she wanted to cry. Every paycheck had been a lifeline, not for her, but for her younger sister Amara. College tuition didn't wait. The electricity bill didn't forgive. Naomi's dreams had always been smaller than Amara's, and she had accepted that, so long as Amara's future could still burn bright. But now, as she watched the chef plate a leftover steak with a flourish meant to disguise cruelty as artistry, Naomi's silence felt like betrayal. She pushed through the kitchen doors back into the dining room, the sudden hush of wealth pressing against her ears. Chandeliers glowed, laughter floated on the air, glasses clinked like a symphony of privilege. Naomi's eyes swept the room until they landed on Ethan. He hadn't moved. He sat with the same patient stillness, his hands folded neatly on the table, his gaze fixed not on the menu, not on the decor, but on the people around him. watching, studying. His face gave nothing away, but his presence seemed to demand attention even in the corner they'd tried to bury him in. Naomi's throat went dry. He looked like someone who had waited through much worse than a late steak. But there was something else in his silence, something deliberate, purposeful, as if every second of waiting was a test he had already prepared for. She moved between tables, pouring wine for one couple, setting down dessert menus for another. But her mind was tethered to that small corner table and the man sitting there with the patience of a stone. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Bradley, the server who should have been attending to him, continued laughing with his favored customers as, Ethan Cross were invisible. Invisible. Naomi clenched her jaw. How many times had she been made to feel the same? How many times had she swallowed the sting of being ignored, only to plaster on a smile and keep moving? She thought of the chef's sneer, the careless way Marcus had carried the steak, the quiet laughter at Ethan's expense. It wasn't just food being served tonight, it was disdain, plated and polished, meant to remind a man of his supposed place. Naomi's pulse pounded. She couldn't stop the memory flashing in her mind. Amara, sitting at their kitchen table late at night, scribbling scholarship essays by the dim light of a thrift store lamp. Her little sister, fighting for a future that could be snatched away with one unpaid bill. That was why Naomi had kept her head down. That was why she had endured. But as she looked at Ethan, his quiet strength a mirror of every injustice she had ever endured, a thought struck her with the force of lightning. Maybe silence was its own form of surrender. Her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin from her apron pocket. She hesitated, the pen poised in her grip. One note could cost her everything, but her heart whispered louder than her fear. If not now, then when? In the corner, Ethan's gaze lifted. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and Naomi swore he saw her, really saw her. Not as a server, not as someone meant to blend into the background, but as a woman standing at a precipice, about to decide if her voice was worth the risk. Her chest rose and fell with a shaky breath. She pressed the pen to the napkin. 3 words formed in a rushed scrawl. Her fate and his dinner were about to collide. Naomi's fingers trembled as she folded the napkin, pressing the ink deeper into the fabric with the weight of her hand, as though permanence might make the words braver than she felt. 3 words, simple, direct, bomb. Impossible to take back once given. Yesterday's leftovers. Her pulse pounded in her ears louder than the chatter of the dining room, louder than the clinking glasses and the soft violin music drifting from the corner. The plate was ready. Marcus had arranged the steak with smug precision, drizzling sauce in a swirl designed to distract the eye. To anyone else, it would look like perfection. To Naomi, it looked like a trap. She lifted it carefully, her arms steady from years of training, though inside her bones screamed with doubt. She carried it through the dining room, weaving between tables of polished couples and smug businessmen, each step feeling heavier than the last. Ethan sat exactly as he had for the past 20 minutes. Hands folded, posture relaxed, eyes steady. He didn't fidget, he didn't scowl. He simply waited, as if the universe owed him nothing and time itself was an ally. Naomi had never seen patience worn like armor before, and the sight of it steeled her. She set the plate down in front of him, her voice calm, practiced. "Your ribeye, sir." "Thank you," Ethan said softly, reaching for his knife and fork. Her heart hammered. This was the moment. She couldn't falter now. She picked up his water glass as if to adjust its placement, a subtle gesture servers performed without thought. But instead of adjusting, she leaned just enough to slip the folded napkin beneath his palm. Her fingers brushed his hand, brief, deliberate, dangerous. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, Naomi thought the world might stop. His gaze was sharp, curious, but not accusing. He didn't flinch, didn't frown. He simply accepted the contact with a stillness that made her throat tighten. Then she straightened, turned, and walked away before courage could abandon her. At the bar, she busied herself polishing glasses, though her hands shook so badly the stems rattled against each other. In the mirror behind the rows of liquor bottles, she stole a glance. Ethan had unfolded the napkin. His face was unreadable, eyes moving across the hastily scrawled words. He didn't react. Not with anger, not with outrage. He didn't stand or call for the manager. He simply folded the napkin again, set it neatly beside his plate, and slid the untouched steak aside. Naomi's breath caught. Was that acceptance? Indifference? Her stomach churned. Maybe he'd expose her. Maybe he'd say her name, loud enough for Richard or David to hear, and by morning she'd be gone, blacklisted from every fine dining establishment in the city. Instead, Ethan reached into his jacket, pulled out a wallet, and placed something on the edge of the table. When Naomi finally gathered the courage to approach, she saw it, a stack of crisp bills, far more than the cost of the meal. As she cleared his plate, he spoke just above a whisper. "Thank you for your honesty." The words struck her harder than any reprimand ever had. Gratitude, from the man who had just been served an insult dressed as dinner. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved, as if her small act had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then louder for the entire dining room to hear, he added, "The service was exceptional." His tone carried enough weight that nearby diners turned to look, confusion flickering across their polished faces. He stood, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked out without another glance back. The heavy glass doors closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving Naomi clutching the bills in her apron, her heart pounding like she'd just set the world on fire. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what her note had unleashed. All she knew was that the truth had finally escaped her lips, if only in ink, and once spoken, it could not be silenced. The dining room hummed on as if nothing had changed, but Naomi felt it in her bones. Everything had. Naomi stood by the bar, her hands pressed flat against the polished wood as if steadying herself from an earthquake only she could feel. The folded napkin sat like a ghost in her memory, its ink still fresh, its message still vibrating through her veins. She replayed the moment over and over, his calm eyes, the way he'd pushed the steak aside, the way his voice had carried across the room when he praised her service. Not anger, not outrage, gratitude. But he was gone now, the heavy glass doors closing behind him with a whoosh that seemed to echo louder than it should. The chandeliers still glowed, forks still clinked, laughter still floated across white linens. But for Naomi, everything had changed. The room felt like it was holding its breath, as if the walls themselves had overheard her secret and were waiting to see what happened next. Richard appeared in the kitchen window a few minutes later, his face flushed with annoyance. "What happened?" he barked toward the servers milling about. "He didn't eat anything." Naomi didn't flinch, didn't blink. "He said he wasn't hungry," she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. Richard's pale eyes narrowed. He knew something was off, but with no proof, he could do nothing but sneer. "Next time, don't waste my food on people who don't appreciate it." "Yes, chef," Naomi said smoothly, her calm surprising even herself. She turned away before he could look deeper into her expression, before he could see the tiny spark of rebellion burning in her chest. Later, when the dining room thinned and the last of the regulars were sipping espresso, Naomi slipped into the break room. She pulled the bills from her apron pocket. $200. For a meal untouched, for a truth too heavy to swallow. She stared at it, her hands trembling, feeling both relief and guilt. Relief that he hadn't exposed her. Guilt that she'd risked everything for a stranger she'd like. Ellie never see again. Sleep was impossible that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every creak of the old apartment made her flinch. Every shadow felt like a threat. Had he known what her note meant? Did he care? Or would tomorrow bring questions she couldn't answer, accusations she couldn't fight? By morning, her stomach twisted with dread as she walked through the employee entrance. Rain slicked her shoes and the gray sky felt like a mirror of her mood. She changed into her uniform with robotic motions, her reflection in the locker mirror looking like someone already bracing for a storm. She had just tied her apron when David Hartley, the general manager, appeared in the doorway. His smile was thin, his eyes sharp as glass. "My office, now." The walk down the hall felt like a funeral march. Other employees glanced up as she passed, some with sympathy, others with quiet relief that it wasn't them. David's office was dark wood and leather, designed to intimidate. He didn't ask her to sit. He simply steepled his fingers and studied her. "I've been reviewing the security footage from last night," he began. "You served table 12. "Yes, sir," Naomi answered, keeping her face still, her voice even. "The gentleman in the casual attire, he didn't eat his meal." "No, sir." David leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Did you say something to him? Something that might have upset him?" Naomi's heart thundered. She forced her features into the practiced neutrality of someone who'd spent years smiling through cruelty. "I served him exactly as I would any other customer." "That's not what I asked." His voice hardened, the air between them thickening. "Did you speak to him about anything other than his order?" Naomi's throat tightened. "I thanked him for coming and wished him a good evening." David's jaw flexed. He didn't believe her. He couldn't prove otherwise, but the suspicion in his gaze pressed on her like a weight. You need to understand, Naomi, he said quietly, almost dangerously. This restaurant has standards. We cater to a certain clientele. Sometimes people wander in who don't fit. It's our job to handle those situations delicately. The words slipped from her mouth before she could stop them. By serving them yesterday's food? The silence was suffocating. David's face went from red to pale in an instant. I don't know what you think you heard, he said finally, his voice low and cold. I didn't hear anything, Naomi lied quickly, backtracking. I was just asking hypothetically. He stood, towering over her, his eyes burning. Let me be very clear. You're already on thin ice being one of the few diverse hires we've made. Don't give me a reason to reconsider that decision. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Naomi nodded once, her hands clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. Yes, sir. Get to work. She left his office with her hands still trembling, but something inside her had shifted. She had crossed the line last night. There was no going back now. Whether she survived it or not, she'd spoken the truth, and the truth had a way of refusing to stay buried. And though she didn't know it yet, the man who had read her note in silence was already setting his own plans in motion. Naomi's hands still shook as she tied her apron tighter, forcing her breathing into shallow, steady counts. David's warning replayed in her head like a broken record. Thin ice. Reconsider that decision. She'd lived her whole life under threats like that, subtle and not so subtle reminders that one wrong move could snatch everything away. She had no savings, no safety net, just her paycheck, her sister's tuition, and the fragile balance she kept by swallowing her pride every single day. But something had shifted. The note she'd written was no longer just an impulsive act. It had become a mark burned into her soul. The moment she'd slipped it into Ethan's hand, she'd chosen a side, even if it meant standing alone. Lunch service began slow. Naomi moved through the dining room like a ghost, her smile plastered on, her voice polished to the exact tone of professional warmth. She refilled water glasses, took orders, laughed lightly at jokes she didn't find funny. But behind her mask, her mind spun. Every time she caught David's eyes cutting across the room, she felt the rope tightening around her neck. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Cross was moving like a shadow through the city. The man who had sat quietly in a corner with a folded napkin now stood at the top floor of a glass tower that looked down on the skyline. His office was a sanctuary of order. Dark oak shelves, a massive desk, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city he had conquered. He scrolled through files on his tablet, each page a piece of the puzzle he had been assembling long before he walked into that restaurant. He wasn't surprised by the note. He had expected something like it, proof of what he already knew was festering beneath the velvet curtains and polished silverware. For years, whispers had reached him about Le Renault. Staff pushed out quietly, customers treated differently depending on how they looked, a kitchen run by fear and prejudice. But whispers weren't enough. Ethan Cross never moved on whispers. He needed evidence, and now he had it. He tapped his phone, connecting with his assistant. I want a full pull on Le Renault, he said. Licenses, inspection records, employment complaints, financial reports, everything. Yes, sir. And find out who Naomi Carter is. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Server, black woman, about 28. I want her work record, quietly. Back in the restaurant, Naomi carried a tray of champagne flutes past a table of businessmen who didn't bother to hide the way their eyes lingered on her, dismissive, appraising. She kept her expression smooth, but inside hate on. Her chest ached. She thought of her sister Amara, sitting at the kitchen table at home, scribbling essays late into the night, asking if the world would ever be different for girls like them. Naomi had always said yes, but tonight she wasn't so sure. When the shift finally ended, she lingered at her locker, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. She opened her notes app and typed slowly. If they fire me, what happens to Amara's tuition? What happens to the rent? To the groceries? She deleted it just as quickly, ashamed of her own fear. At that exact moment, Ethan sat in the backseat of a sleek black car, scrolling through her employee record. Flawless customer reviews, the highest number of repeat requests of any server, a quiet pattern of being assigned to the worst sections, late shifts, double bookings. He saw the story between the lines, the quiet punishment for someone who never quite fit. He closed the file, his jaw tightening. They thought they were untouchable. They thought no one noticed. But he noticed. Naomi might have believed she was alone, standing on that thin ice, waiting for it to crack. She didn't know that Ethan Cross was already underneath the surface, ready to shatter the whole lake. And while she fought to survive another day in silence, he was preparing for a confrontation that would rip the mask off the entire empire. The question wasn't if the reckoning would come. It was when. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the afternoon, its sound swallowed by the low hum of the dining room. Naomi balanced a tray of espresso cups, weaving between tables with the same grace she had learned over years of carrying burdens heavier than porcelain. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Every time she glanced toward the door, her chest tightened with a strange, unspoken anticipation. She told herself she was being foolish. Men like him didn't return. Not to places like this. Not after what had happened. But at 2:30 sharp, the glass doors opened and Ethan Cross stepped inside. This time, he wasn't dressed like the billionaire CEO the newspapers loved to photograph. No tailored suit, no silk tie. Instead, he wore a black hoodie, rain droplets clinging to the shoulders, and a pair of worn sneakers that squeaked against the marble floor. His hood was down, his expression calm, but his presence still drew every eye the moment he entered. The hostess, Victoria, stiffened at the sight of him. Her painted smile faltered, then returned, brittle and forced. "Oh," she said, her tone sugar-coated with disdain. "You again." Ethan's voice was quiet, steady. "I'd like a table in Naomi's section." Her painted lips curled. "We don't take requests for specific servers." "You do today." His tone carried no threat, but it left no room for argument. Victoria hesitated, caught between her instinct to dismiss him and the strange authority in his words. Finally, she led him through the dining room again, past the window tables, past the intimate corners, and stopped at another poor seat. This one near the hallway to the restrooms. She gestured stiffly. "Here you are." Ethan sat without complaint. Naomi's heart pounded as she approached, forcing her steps to stay measured, her smile calm. "Welcome back, sir." "Hello, Naomi." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "I'm hoping today's meal will be fresher." Her breath caught. He knew. Of course he knew. She gave a small nod, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. "I'll do my best to ensure that. Just water to start?" "Actually." He leaned back, picking up the leather-bound wine menu, flipping through it with the ease of a man who had done this many times before. "Let's see your wine list." The dining room hummed on around them, but Naomi felt the shift. A woman in diamonds at the next table leaned toward her husband. "Why do they let people like that in here? It ruins the ambience." Her companion chuckled. "Probably saved up for months just to eat here once. Watch, he'll order the cheapest thing on the menu and water." Naomi's jaw tightened, her hand gripping her order pad so hard the pen dug into her skin. She glanced at Ethan, wondering if he had heard. He had. When she returned with her notepad ready, he spoke clearly, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I'll have the 2015 Chateau Margaux." Naomi froze. That bottle was worth $3,000. The couple beside him fell silent, their smug laughter vanishing into stunned quiet. "Of course, sir," Naomi said, her voice smooth though her heart raced. She carried the order slip to the cellar, where the bottles gleamed like jewels under soft light. But before she could reach for the Margaux, Chef Richard appeared with Marcus at his side, their eyes glinting with mockery. "Your friend wants the Margaux?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here, give him this." He handed her a different bottle, its label similar but cheaper, worth maybe $300 at best. "He won't know the difference. We'll charge him for the Margaux, of course. Save him the embarrassment when his card gets declined." Naomi stared at the bottle in her hands, her throat closed. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The rules, the threats, the risks. In the dining room, Ethan sat quietly, waiting. When she returned, her smile was practiced, her motions flawless. She presented the bottle with steady hands, uncorked it, poured the taste. Ethan examined it, his dark eyes flicking briefly over the label. His expression didn't change. He swirled the glass, inhaled the aroma, then took a sip. "This is excellent," he said, placing the glass down. "Please give my compliments to your sommelier." Naomi's stomach nodded. He knew. She could see it in the faint curl of his lips, in the sharpness hidden beneath his calm tone. He knew exactly what bottle he had been served. And still, he drank. Still, he waited. She realized then that this wasn't about wine or steak or even dignity. This was a test, and the restaurant was failing it with every smug laugh, every calculated slight, every fraudulent bottle placed on the table. Naomi's chest ached. The air in the dining room felt heavy, as though a storm were gathering overhead. And she knew, deep down, that when it finally broke, nothing in this place would be left the same. The air in Le Renault had shifted. Conversations that once floated effortlessly now seemed to hang, brittle and uneasy, as though every diner could feel the quiet storm building at table 12. Naomi moved through the dining room with her usual grace, but her chest burned with the weight of what she'd just done. She had served him the wrong bottle. She had let them use her hands to carry their fraud. And he knew. Of course, he knew. When Ethan asked for the check, it was David Hartley himself who appeared at the table. His smile was tight, his eyes sharp with suspicion, the expression of a man who had mastered the art of false charm. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction, sir." Ethan set his glass down, his voice calm, deliberate. "The wine was interesting. Not quite what I ordered, but educational nonetheless." David's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. "I'm sure you're mistaken. The 2015 Chateau Margaux has a very distinctive profile. Different from the 2018 Burgundy you actually served," Ethan replied, his tone conversational but carrying just enough weight that several nearby tables fell silent. "I can see the real Margaux in your cellar display from here. The bottle shape is unmistakable." The color drained from David's face. He opened his mouth, but Ethan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "No need to correct the bill. Charge me for what I ordered. I believe in paying full price for education." Gasps rippled through the dining room. Patrons leaned forward, forks forgotten midair, as David fumbled with the sleek black card Ethan handed him. The metal gleamed under the chandelier light. A black card, the kind only the wealthiest few in the world carried. David's hands trembled as he swiped it. Approved. Of course, it was approved. When he returned, Ethan signed the receipt with steady strokes, his voice calm but clear enough for all to hear. "You know, in my experience, restaurants that substitute wines without informing customers often have other ethical flexibility. Makes one wonder what else might be substituted." The words hung in the air, heavy, damning. David swallowed hard, his smile broken. Ethan stood, leaving another generous tip for Naomi. As he passed her, his voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for her ears. "Truth always costs something, but it pays more in the end." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he was doing this, who he really was, but the words stuck. She could only watch as he walked out, the glass doors closing softly behind him, leaving the dining room buzzing with speculation. "Who is that man?" a woman in diamonds whispered, her face pale with unease. At the bar, Jamal Washington, the quiet busboy who had worked in the shadows for 5 years, leaned toward Naomi while pretending to polish a glass. His voice was low, urgent. "That man, he's somebody." Naomi turned to him, her hands trembling around the bills Ethan had pressed into her palm. "What do you mean?" "The way he carries himself, the way he knew about that wine, that's no ordinary customer. And that card he pulled out?" Jamal's eyes flicked toward the door. "That's not just a credit card. That's the kind of card billionaires use, the kind of card that can buy a building." Naomi's heart lurched. A billionaire? She shook her head. It couldn't be. He had walked in wearing a hoodie, sneakers still damp from the rain. He had sat at the worst table in the house. He had been treated like he didn't belong. And yet somehow, he had turned the entire room on its head with nothing but patience, knowledge, and calm words that cut sharper than knives. Jamal's warning landed heavy in her chest. "Be careful, Naomi. When rich folks play games, it's working people who get hurt." But even as fear pressed in on her, another feeling bloomed quietly beneath it: hope. For the first time since she'd started at Le Renault, someone with power had seen what she saw, felt what she felt. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stormed out. He had simply let the truth speak for itself. And Naomi knew deep down this was far from over. Somehow she felt it in her bones. The real confrontation hadn't even begun. Rain tapped against the tall windows of Le Renault like impatient fingers the next afternoon. Naomi stood at the service station folding napkins, each crease sharper than the last, trying to steady her hands. Her body was there, but her thoughts were miles away, circling endlessly around one man. The way he had sat, silent but unshaken. The way he had exposed the wine swap with surgical precision. The way his eyes had lingered on her as though he knew she carried more truth than she dared speak aloud. At 2:15, the doors opened. Naomi looked up, and her breath caught. Ethan Cross walked in again. Same dark hoodie, same rain-damp sneakers, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman strode beside him, tall, confident, her expensive navy suit fitting like armor. Her stride was deliberate, her phone already in her hand, recording the moment she entered. Naomi recognized her instantly. Sandra Palmer, a food critic whose reviews were sharp enough to kill careers. The hostess, Victoria, froze, her smile flickering between polished welcome and startled panic. "Table for two?" "Yes," Ethan said smoothly, then his gaze shifted. and I'd like Naomi Carter to serve us. Victoria stiffened. She's not available for... You'll make her available, Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but absolute. Sandra Palmer lowered her phone slightly, her arched brow daring the hostess to disagree. Victoria's painted smile cracked as she gestured them toward a table, not at the back, not near the kitchen, but right in the center of the dining room where every eye could see. Naomi felt her chest tighten as she walked forward. Her steps were careful, her voice calm, but her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. "Welcome back, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am." Ethan smiled faintly. "Naomi, this is Sandra Palmer. I told her about the unique service I've received here." Sandra extended her hand. "I've heard good things about you, honest things." Naomi shook it, her skin prickling. She didn't know what Ethan was planning, but she felt the weight of it building, heavy as thunderclouds. They ordered the sea bass, Naomi recommending it in a low voice because she had seen it freshly prepared that morning. For once, Richard didn't dare cut corners. The kitchen worked with mechanical precision, the weight of Sandra's reputation pressing down on every slice and stir. Plates emerged flawless, sauces gleaming, presentation immaculate. But it wasn't the foul Sandra cared about. Halfway through the meal, she asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Tell me, Naomi, is it common here for the best servers to be demoted to prep work in the basement?" Naomi froze. The question was a blade pressed to her throat. She could lie, she could protect herself, or she could tell the truth. Her eyes flicked to Ethan. His expression was calm, expectant, but behind it was something harder. An invitation, a challenge. "I couldn't comment on management decisions," Naomi said finally, her voice steady but heavy with implication. Sandra's pen scratched against her notebook, her smirk knowing. Very diplomatic. From the corner of the room, a familiar figure shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Harold Morrison, one of the restaurant's investors, was dining as usual. His silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, his sharp eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold. He picked up his wine glass, but his focus never left Ethan. Half an hour later, Harold rose and approached their table. His voice was smooth, but his jaw was tight. "Excuse the interruption. I couldn't help but notice Miss Palmer dining with us today. Harold Morrison, investor here at Le Renault." Sandra looked up, unimpressed. "So you're one of the men who profits from all this?" Ethan stood, extending his hand. "Ethan Cross." The name landed like a thunderclap. Harold's face paled, then flushed, recognition slicing across his features. Ethan Cross, billionaire CEO, kingmaker in boardrooms, a man whose reputation for hostile takeovers was the stuff of Wall Street legend. Around them, whispers rippled through the dining room. "Cross? Ethan Cross?" Harold's voice faltered. "I wasn't aware you dined here." "Recently started," Ethan replied mildly. "The service has been educational." Sandra's pen moved faster, capturing every word. David Hartley appeared at the edge of the scene, his smile brittle, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Mr. Cross?" he stammered. "What an honor! Had we known, you would have hidden your worst habits better?" Ethan's voice cut like steel. He looked at Harold, then at David, then at the room full of silent witnesses. 7 times I've dined here. 7 times I've been treated as less than. I've documented every slight, every substitution, every act of discrimination. And I think it's time the truth stopped hiding behind white tablecloths. Gasps echoed. The chandeliers seemed to hum with the charge in the air. Naomi's chest rose and fell in sharp breaths, her heart hammering. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was a trial. Harold's voice cracked as he said, "What exactly do you want, Mr. Cross?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room. "Change," he said simply, "or I'll buy this place out from under you and burn it clean." The words landed like a verdict, and Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The chandeliers above seemed to tremble with the weight of silence. Every fork was lowered, every whisper stilled. Naomi stood rooted to the floor, her pulse hammering as Ethan's words cut through the room. "Change, or I'll buy this place out from under you and burn it clean." David Hartley's face drained of color. Harold Morrison swallowed hard, his knuckles white around his wine glass, and Sandra Palmer, still recording with her phone resting discreetly against her water glass, didn't blink once. Naomi could feel the air shift. This wasn't a bluff. Ethan Cross had walked into this temple of arrogance, eaten nothing, drunk a lie, and now he stood like a judge handing down a sentence. David tried first. His voice was sharp, defensive, trembling at the edges. "Mr. Cross, with all due respect, this is a misunderstanding. We have standards here, not..." Ethan's gaze flicked toward him, quiet but lethal. Standards? He repeated. Serving leftovers to the man you assume won't. Notice? Watering down wine for the guest you think can't pay? Demoting your best server to the basement because she dared to show dignity? That isn't standards. That's rot wearing a tuxedo. Gasps rippled across the dining room. Naomi's throat tightened, but she couldn't look away. Harold raised a trembling hand, his voice more cautious. Ethan, surely there's a way to resolve this privately. No, Ethan said firmly. Privately is how this survives. Quiet corners, closed doors, whispers no one hears. Not anymore. You've built an empire on exclusion, Harold, and you've let men like him, his eyes cut toward David, poison it in the name of profit. David's jaw clenched, but his hands shook as they rested against the back of a chair. We've done nothing illegal, he spat. Ethan's laugh was low, humorless. Illegal? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim black folder. He opened it on the white tablecloth, spreading documents like a dealer laying down cards. Health code violations ignored. Employee discrimination complaints silenced with threats. Supplier kickbacks. Wage theft. Do you want me to keep going? Sandra leaned forward, her pen scratching, her camera catching every word. The entire dining room had turned into a courtroom, and Naomi realized she wasn't just a witness. She was Exhibit A. Ethan's voice softened then, but it cut deeper than any shout. Naomi, come here. Her breath caught. The entire room turned to her as she stepped forward, her palms slick, her legs weak. Tell them, Ethan said, his eyes steady on hers. Tell them what this place is like, not as they want to be seen, but as it is. Naomi's throat went dry. She looked at David, his eyes blazing with warning. She looked at Harold, his face pale with dread. Then she looked at Ethan, calm, steady, unshaken. Her voice trembled at first, but she spoke. For 2 years I've worked here. I've been given the worst sections, the worst, hifts. I've been called things that never make it onto paper. I've watched black customers shoved to the back, Latino families ignored, immigrants mocked in the kitchen. I've watched this restaurant pretend dignity is a privilege instead of a right. The words rang through the dining room. Naomi's hands shook, but she didn't stop. And I stayed. Because I needed the paycheck. Because my sister's tuition depended on it. Because I thought silence was the price of survival. But silence is what they count on. The room erupted in murmurs. Sandra's pen flew. Ethan nodded slowly, his voice quiet but carrying. This is what I wanted them to hear, the truth. David snapped, his mask shattering. She's lying. She's bitter, looking for pity. His voice rose, desperate. You'll ruin us over the word of a waitress? Ethan's hand slammed flat against the table, the sound like thunder. A waitress who has more integrity in one word than you've shown in your entire career. The force of it silenced even David. Ethan straightened, his presence towering though his voice stayed calm. Here's the ultimatum. Fire David Hartley. Remove Richard Beaumont from the kitchen. Replace them with leaders who understand respect. Naomi Carter becomes general manager effective immediately, with authority over hiring and standards. And every guest who walks through these doors, every guest, is treated as though they belong. Or, he slid a document across the table toward Harold. I buy you out, today. The lawyers are waiting for my call. The room held its breath. Harold's hand shook as he picked up the paper, his lips pressed together, shame written across his face. He looked around at the diners, at Sandra's recording, at the damning evidence Ethan had already made public just by speaking it aloud. Then he nodded. We'll do it. David's voice cracked. You can't. You're finished, David. Ha. Harold said sharply. Clear your office. The sound of applause started softly, from one table in the corner, then another. Then another. Within moments, the dining room was filled with clapping, some patrons even rising to their feet. The chandeliers glittered as though reflecting the spark of something new being born. Naomi's eyes stung with tears she fought to hold back. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady, a faint smile breaking through his steel. This all began with a note, he said softly, only for her. A truth you refuse to bury. Never underestimate the power of courage, Naomi. It's more valuable than money. It changes the world. Her throat tightened, but she managed to whisper, Why me? Ethan's answer was simple, devastating, unforgettable. Because when I walked into this room, you were the only one who saw me as human. The words shattered her, not with pain, but with something far deeper, validation, hope. As the applause roared around them, Naomi felt the world tilt. She had written 3 words on a napkin, and those words had toppled an empire. And standing beside Ethan Cross, she realized this was only the beginning.